Okay, you're good.
All right. Good afternoon, folks. Glad to see y'all digitally, at least. And today we've got an interesting topic that I think that is going to be incredibly helpful in thinking through the contours of American religion in the Antebellum period. We're going to be thinking about African American religion, and as I was preparing this today, it seems to me helpful in the future for us to together to explore larger trends in the history of religion in the United States. So in the coming weeks, I'll start putting together some things that some programs here for Facebook Live that take a broad view of American religion and try to fit the African American experience and the Confederate experience that we talked about a few weeks ago into a larger narrative. So that's kind of the projection for the next few weeks and months of me doing these Facebook Live events. So we'll be looking at American religion for the next couple of months. So in any case, today we are going to be looking at African American religion, and largely this is going to be maybe a 30,000-foot view, sort of a sweeping overview of the field. Exploring how we know African American religion in the 18th and 19th century. And so we're going to focus on a few scholars, a few very important interpretations, think a little bit about some not necessarily contradictions, but some scholarly debates over continuity versus discontinuity from the African traditions. So it's a big field, an interesting field, and I think probably the best way to do it is just to go ahead and start and talk about these scholars. So today, what I'll be focusing on is the story of African American history and religious history, following five really important scholars, sort of generational thinkers, people who have put together big sweeping narratives, very large interpretive moves being made. First, W.B. Du Bois. You can't do African American religion without starting at the beginning. And the beginning, as far as our scholarly understanding goes, is from the great sociologist W.B. Du Bois. We'll also look at Eugene Genovese, who in the second half of the 20th century became probably the leading historian of enslavement in the South, and then historian who really focused in the latter part of his career on understanding the mind, what he called the mind of the master class. But in the 1970s, in the 1980s, Genovese was very much known for his work in African American history and history of enslavement in the United States. And then we're going to look at Albert Raboteau, who did my favorite, probably. If you polled most historians, I think that Raboteau's book, The Invisible, his book would rank very, very highly, 1978. And then we'll look at Sylvia Fry and Betty Wood, who did a great book called Come Shouting to Zion back in the late 1990s. So let's start with Du Bois. Du Bois is the pivotal figure in the scholarly understanding of African American history. He's a sociologist by training, and did a tremendous amount of ethnographic work and field work in black churches in the late 19th and early 20th century. And much of what he writes about during his career focuses on contemporary issues in the late 19th and early 20th century, particularly the race line as he saw it, what role the church would have in eliminating racial distinction in the United States. But he also did some historical work, interviewed former slaves, took oral traditions, looked at things like singing and ritual expression very, very seriously. So he very much lays the foundation for later studies. In fact, most of what he writes about are pieces of, what he writes about are still the questions that historians are engaging with today. And the two big books in which he laid out his view of religion in African American communities. His first Negro Church was 1903, and then The Souls of Black Folks, which is also 1903. Prodigious writer, just tremendous output, incredible scholarship, incredible research, incredible field work, really just phenomenal intellectual production. Then the third book, or third essay, actually it's an essay, the first two are books, and the third is an essay called Will the Church Remove the Color Line, are all of the three texts from which I'm drawing these, making generalizations about what Du Bois's work was all about, and how he sets the agenda. There's some pretty big themes in Du Bois, and as I said, he sets the table for what historians have been doing for the 117 years since he published the Negro Church. And the really important thing that he lays out, and one that historians have wrestled with, have gotten into pretty serious arguments about, is this idea of syncretism. It's the idea that African Americans or African descended individuals, of course, before the slave trade is abolished, people being stolen directly from Africa, coming to British North America and then the United States. That these individuals and groups were able to cobble together, to put together, to borrow, to adjust, to adapt their traditional religious beliefs to new contexts. And this is the idea of syncretism. It's still an important theme in current studies. It's really the it's kind of the guiding principle. How did these individuals and groups who were ripped from their homelands, who endured weeks and months of imprisonment on the West African coast, and then endured the Middle Passage, how were they able to keep elements of their traditional religions alive? Did they? Some historians have argued they weren't able to. I think the most recent scholarship, however, shows very clearly that the persistences are there. But it's a matter of degree. And Du Bois is the first one who makes this very important point about memories that are carried along across the Atlantic during the Middle Passage, and then reconstituted in various ways. Sometimes traditionally, sometimes borrowing, sometimes borrowing both from traditional African religions and West African religions, and also some Islamic traditions. So in any case, this fusion is important when thinking about, especially when thinking about the generations of African descended people who come after the slave trade is abolished in 1808, and the ways that the older traditional practices were then blended with evangelical Protestantism, with the revival religion of Whitefield and Wesley and others through the 19th century. How did those come to be put together, and how did they affect each other, and how did they move back and forth? And this is one of the things later historians have really delved into, this reciprocal relationship between Black communities and white communities, white religious leaders, Black religious leaders, Black lay people, and white religious leaders, both lay and ordained. And in thinking about the ways that they borrowed from each other, the ways that they worked back and forth, and how they influenced each other. So it's a very malleable story. It's one of adaptation. It's one of adjustment, and it's also one of power, because as Du Bois points out, in the churches, African descended people and African American individuals and groups were able to carve out some autonomy, and it was a place where unlike anywhere else in British North America or the United States, the people of African descent were able to express their autonomy in largely unfettered ways. in churches that are formed after the revivals in the 1730s and 40s. You begin to see, and Du Bois lays this out very clearly, you begin to see a very complicated church organization. And it's a church organization that's not just focused on the rituals of conversion, the ritual performances of day worship. These institutions, and this continues through, until this afternoon. This idea that the churches were more than just religious institutions, strictly and narrowly defined. The churches had multiple functions. They had social functions. They had political functions. They were very important institutions for social betterment. They were highly democratic, places where people of African descent were able to, free and slaves or enslaved, were able to carve out places for themselves in British America, and then most specifically in the United States. The influence of the church is incredibly broad, almost political in its positioning and in its influence. Something also that's very important that Du Bois pointed out, or very early on, is the influence of women in the churches, particularly, he says, during the days of slavery. And we'll get to this a little bit. Dave Fry Ben Wood and Sylvia Fry do a really nice job of teasing out some of the influences and the foundational influences of women. But Du Bois noticed this very early in his study, and he noticed it in the churches that he was looking at in the late 19th and early 20th century. So he was able to see some continuities, and he was beginning to tease these out. I don't think it's until Fry and Wood put their book together in the late 1990s that we really get a good full view of women's participation in these churches and the centrality of women in the church. But again, Du Bois noticed this. So he's noticed, he recognizes a lot of the important social, political, religious, moral components of the church that have set the table for continued studies and continued articulation and continued understandings of what happens in these churches, what happened in these churches. Something else that Du Bois was very well aware, and it's largely because he is very much in the middle of civil rights activity, anti-Jim Crow activity. He's involved in the Niger movement. He's involved in helping found the NAACP. He's very, very concerned about the relationship between Black churches and white churches, and the ways that, especially in the days during enslavement, that white churches were used as a form of social control. And he sees that again. He has very strong words about the failures of white Christianity in the late 19th and early 20th century. And historically, he makes some of the same observations about the ways that faith was used to enslave people, to control people, and to dominate people. This is an important theme, and again, it continues to roll through all of the scholarship. Another thing that he picks up on early on is the influence and the popularity of Baptist and Methodist. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, but it's definitely the evangelical popular denominations. I think we talked a little bit about this when we did the pro-slavery theology talk a few weeks ago. But the notion that the Baptists and the Methodists and popular religion and this common sense hermeneutic very much dominates American religion is important here, and something that Du Bois, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. But really, it's hard to overstate how important Du Bois is to laying the groundwork for continuing studies of African American religion. Incredible thinker, incredible scholar, amazing output, incredible insight. I can't say enough about it. So if you really want to go to the beginning point of scholarly understanding of Black religion, take a look at the Negro Church and take a look at the souls of Black folks. Spend some time with Du Bois because his insights are vital and foundational. We fast forward. I don't want to. There's some great scholarship in the mid, the 1920s and 30s. Franklin Fraser and Carter Woodson produced some really important books in the 1920s and then again in the 1960s that focus on there were parts of the Black religious experience. And this is kind of how scholarship works. You have a synthetic model, something big like what Du Bois is doing, is put together, and then further research, continuing insights, continuing scholarship continues to build a broader, more nuanced picture. So, when you look at a book like The History of the Negro Church by Carter Woodson from 1921, it goes into a little bit more detail into the structures of the church. Franklin Fraser, the Negro Church, written in 1964, really begins to think about the ways that the church develops institutionally. So as these moments of synthetic thinking come along, you want to look to these larger studies that bring these more detailed monographic insights to the table. You want to bring those together and paint a much larger picture. So there's some really fine scholarship that takes place between the beginning of the 20th century and 1970. But as far as influence in the contemporary academy and contemporary thinking about African American religion and African American history and the history of enslavement, it really have to start with Eugene Genovese's Roll Jordan Roll, which was published in 1972. And as he writes about the history of enslavement broadly, and thinks about the agency that African descended people exert over their existence, not only in the church but also in the fields and in the slave quarter, in public settings, in the ways that Black people are able to carve out space for themselves and take control of their lives in as many ways as possible. And it's an important turn in the way that historians and then later the public look at slavery and look at the humanity of the enslaved people, look at the ways that they can work within a really repressive and oppressive system, a system of very strict control, and how they can carve out places for themselves. And Genovese rightly points out that the church is, just as Du Bois had pointed out, the church is one of these places where, and probably the best place to look to understand the autonomy and the agency that African Americans are exerting over their lives. And Genovese generally focuses on the period between the end of the American Revolution and the Civil War. So, a little bit closer to the Civil War era here, specifically in what he has to say. One of the things that he points out very early on, and again, this is something that Du Bois has said, and this is something that scholars since both of these fellows that have written say over again, is that whites tried to control the religious lives of the enslaved. But he adds a very important but. He said, but the enslaved overtly, covertly, and even intuitively fought to shape it themselves. That within these congregations, within the private spaces that are carved out by the enslaved, they're able to take control over their own spiritual lives, their own moral lives, their own social lives, and even political lives, and as they are working in these larger institutions. And there are a couple of important places and spaces where African American religion is performed. One is in Black churches, emerging Black churches after the 1790s. You begin to see in urban places, in the 1780s and 1790s, you're seeing large churches in urban southern towns being established and created to serve Black congregations, led by Black pastors led by black deacons, and these become very important institutions. There's also an institutional relationship between the enslaved and whites in the biracial churches in the rural areas, where blacks and whites worship together. And there's then the private space, the hush harbors, the ring shouts that are performed in the quarters or out of the view of whites. And so there's a whole invisible side, as Rabideau says, an invisible side to African American religion. So the African American religion exists in a lot of different planes, and it draws from a lot of different spaces. And I'm going to get ahead of the story just a little bit here, but one of the things that so if you look at it broadly, before 1730 or so, there wasn't a tremendous amount of outreach by white missionaries to African descended people, and it's not really until the 1740s and 50s with the revivals, George Whitefield, John Wesley, and others who lead the religious institutions in British North America in a revivalistic direction. It's not until there's a revivalistic religion very much based on preaching and oral performance, and the liberatory notion of immediate conversion. It's not until those pieces are in place and you begin to see this common sense theology develop, and this democratic ecclesiology develop in the United States, as opposed to the established church and the Anglican, the Church of England. It's not until you begin to get into the popular religion, the Methodists and the Baptists, you see larger numbers of African descended people come into the Christian churches. Prior to that, you would have seen a tremendous lot of traditional religious practices. You probably would have seen some Islam in the course of the enslaved, but very little before the revivals, very little Protestantism or Protestant Christianity within the quarters. And one of the things that Genovese, I think, quite astutely points out is that, because even when he's writing about slavery, he's thinking about that reciprocal relationship. He's thinking about how masters and slaves are wrapped up together in this very complicated relationship, abusive relationship, dominating social structures and orders. But the thing that he points out, I think, is quite important. I think Genovese is the first to really come right out and say it this way. He said, no matter how obedient, how Uncle Thomas Christianity made a slave, it also drove deep down into his soul an awareness of the moral limits of submission. It placed a master above his own master, and thereby dissolved the moral and ideological ground on which the very principles of absolute human lordship must exist. Within the logic of Christianity is this notion of the equality of souls. And when an enslaved individual applies that rule to and applies that theology to everyone, then in the end, the master has no more power over him than allowed. And it's an important turn, because what it does is it creates a moral foundation on which to base opposition to slavery. In the most extreme cases, Vesey, Gabriel, Nat Turner, all use the Bible and all use the emancipatory logic of the Bible and of this sense of the moral limits of submission as their spur for conducting slave uprisings, rebellions during the first third of the 19th century. So you can apply that more broadly to everyday relationships. the quality of souls, the sense that everyone has a master. It becomes a very important tool for carving out social space and providing place a moral foundation for opposing slavery in a language that resonates with white Americans. Really important observation, really important claim, and still continues. It really kind of plays into this notion of the political and social impact of the Black church, and this kind of, I think, undergirds that whole operation. This idea of the moral limits of submission. Because Genovese says, he said Christianity, quote, spoke for all humanity when it proclaimed the freedom and inviolability of the human soul. Everyone is equal in this new Protestant Christianity, at least is the way that this is interpreted by African American preachers, by African American lay people, and those who were allied with them. So there is the problems, of course, when you're thinking about this relationship between Black and white Christians. It becomes difficult when the slave system itself is begins to expand in the late part of the 18th and first part of the 19th century, when a system that had been slowly, perhaps, losing its sway over American life, but with the development of the profession of cotton gin. And then the expansion of the cotton plantation south across the deep south and into the Mississippi River Valley. The whole logic of slavery changes. The expansiveness of slavery changes too. It becomes a growing rather than a stagnating institution. It becomes a very profitable institution. And white planters are loath to see an end to slavery, no matter what kinds of moral opposition is put in front of them. The logic of the system, and remember, this is about the time, so that late 18th, early 19th century, as we identified last time, is about the time that you're beginning to see well-developed and emerging pro-slavery theologies begin to become popular. There had been, in fact, in the late 18th century, some anti-slavery moves amongst evangelicals. At the beginning of the 19th century, you're starting to see a closing of the ranks. So this division, there's increasing division in the way that the Bible's read, in the ways that religion is practiced, the way that religion is used, becomes particularly acute in the 1830s. And this fight for control, this fight for authority, really comes to a head after Turner's rebellion, after Nat Turner's insurrection, however you want to term it. This, and he's a Baptist preacher. And it's very much influenced by biblical claims to freedom, and it's a mainspring for what that rebellion had become, or what it did become. So as you move into the 1830s, so you got a period where there's not a tremendous amount of, as I was saying before 1750, not a tremendous amount of affiliation for African descended people in the Christian churches in British North America. Then you have revival religion that comes along that begins to influence and draw African Americans into the realm of Protestant Christianity, and then you begin to see the growth of free and enslaved churches that become broadly popular. In fact, the largest church, for example, the largest church in Augusta, Georgia in 1850 was Springfield Baptist, the all-Black church. And its largest congregation, largest Baptist church in the state at the time. So you see these institutions begin to grow. You see these churches begin to grow. You begin to see the practices within the slave quarters begin to grow, and more families, and then associating with the evangelical churches in the first part of the 19th century. But as whites begin to recognize that religion in these free black churches in the quarters, preached by chairback preachers, controlled by African Americans, whites began to, by 1830, see this as a threat and see this as a danger. Remember too that this is the same time, 1831, is when the Liberator begins publication. So whites are beginning to see anti-slavery language being used against them. They see some northern ministers, not all, but some northern ministers beginning to criticize the institution of slavery in pretty direct terms. Some going so far as to say that slavery is a Christian institution, which by the common sense reading of the Bible is, that's something that was broadly accepted. But you have a couple of things that are happening. You have African Americans' assertions of independence that are coming in a very militant form. Also, then being backed by people like William Lloyd Garrison and other white Northern abolitionists who are calling for an immediate end to slavery. So the response, of course, is to clamp down, and in fact, you see it very clearly before, let's say it's 1827, 1828 in rural Georgia, in the cotton planting districts of rural Georgia. You have large biracial churches that met every other Sunday. They didn't meet every Sunday. Sometimes they only met once a month. But on the Sundays when church was in, the enslaved, this is in the 2010s and 20s, you would have seen as many as 100 to 150 enslaved people walking together to one of the isolated rural churches. So in the way that the story goes, is the groups of folks who were the farthest away from the church would begin walking, and as they got closer, they would stop at different plantations, and they would pick up the individuals who were the enslaved people who were part of the congregation. They would walk to church together. So it wouldn't be unusual to see a group of 100, 150 enslaved people traveling together down a road on a Sunday. Well, after Nat Turner's rebellion, that becomes a problem for whites. You would also have seen in town, you would have seen prayer meetings and Sunday school meetings being held, not in the churches, but perhaps in the kitchen of a household, where not just enslaved members of the household, but also neighbors, enslaved persons, come together to meet in a kitchen, in an extra room, in the barn, to have private prayer meetings, and from which whites were excluded. These lead to some real frightening moments for white Georgians. First, of course, the specter of seeing 150 enslaved people walking down the road going to church becomes quite terrifying to whites, thinking about what had happened in Southwest Virginia, or excuse me, Southeastern Virginia in 1831. There are also rumors of slave uprisings in Augusta, and in other places in Georgia and South Carolina. So there's a real visceral fear that develops in these institutions, both private and public. So the church, Springfield Church, and then its satellite church, the Thankful Church, are shut down. Marshals board the doors up. and forbid the black ministers for leading worship services, the meetings, like the one held in Susan Hutchinson's kitchen in Augusta, Georgia. Those were stopped, and as the white response to these threats of insurrection rose, so too did the limits that were placed on African Americans. And this is the period during which the greatest restrictions were placed on black churches. Though there's a tremendous amount of pushback against that, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes. But by and large, however, this space that had been available to people of African descent is very much circumscribed after 1831. There are new rules for socialization. There are new rules for traveling together. There's a rule at the Greensboro, a church in Greensboro, Georgia, that springs to mind. If an enslaved member of the church has to go to the restroom, he has to go in the presence of one of the white members. No more than two enslaved persons could be together at any given time. And the churches, the congregations write these rules, and they're pretty much self-regulating. They have their own disciplinary structures in place. So, there's a serious clampdown that goes on, and this begins to change the ways that enslaved people could practice their religion. This is not to say that they shrugged their shoulders and said, "Oh well, that's just it." In fact, they continue to push. They continue to push, particularly in these private settings, and then as you get into the 1840s and the 1850s, in more institutional settings, begin to reassert themselves, not asking for, but demanding that they be allowed to have their own churches in the rural districts. So it's not just in the towns where you're seeing these all-black churches, so you've got an institutional church, and you also have a private church, and that exists outside of all of the control of white masters or overseers or observers, that Albert Rabbitoe calls the invisible institution. He wrote a book in 1978 called "Slave Religion: The Invisible Institution in the Antebellum South," and it's a fascinating look into the non-institutional practices of enslaved persons on plantations. And he is very concerned with this question, as most historians of African American religion are, of blending and assimilation. How much assimilation took place? How much cultural memory persists into the middle part of the 19th century? He kind of splits the difference between Herskovitz on one end and Fraser on the other. Herskovitz says there's a tremendous amount of continuity. E. Franklin Fraser says there's not any continuity at all. The middle passage erased all those memories of traditional African religions. And Rabbitoe, I think, quite wisely takes something of a moderate position here, and he recognizes places where there are very clear continuities, and places where the continuities are more discontinuous than continuous. And I think it's a really prudent way to take a look at these at this experience. So when he looks at blending and assimilation, he saw, and I think this is important, Rabbitoe goes back and he looks at religious practices in West Africa, and he's looking for elements of these various religious practices that might have some sort of connection, some sort of link, some sort of commonality with Protestant Christianity that would make it appealing to people who had been enslaved and taken to North America. Two things that he sees as being very, very important touchstones and connectors. And first is that according to Rabbit, all the West African belief systems included a high God or a supreme God or a supreme power. Underneath that are multiple lesser gods, and this is something that we could if we looked at Latin America, we'd be looking at a very different story. We'd be looking at a story that's dominated by Catholicism, by enslaved populations that are overwhelmingly 80-90% enslaved persons, lots of young men. It's a very different environment. But in the context of Catholic Latin America, you would have seen a correlation between the saints and the intercessory gods that function at a level below the supreme God in the African belief system. So you look at Latin America, and it's a very different story. So in any case, but all the West African religions, according to Rabbit, have a belief in a high God, which makes it easy to translate that to a monotheistic faith, and looks familiar, feels familiar, has a familiar conceptual aura to it. The other thing that he points out is that the West African belief systems were very much influenced by the intercessory power of priests and religious leaders within these communities. And so those two commonalities for Rabbit are key in understanding how missionaries eventually were able to introduce Protestantism into the enslaved communities. And then, after that, once it's introduced, it takes on a life of its own in all kinds of variety. You got to remember that the system of slavery in the United States, the British North America, the United States, covers a large territory, and it covers a lot of different places that are culturally distinct. Virginia is different than the Low Country. South Carolina is different than the uplands of Georgia, is different from the Mississippi River Valley, different from Louisiana, southern Louisiana, where we have a lot of sugar plantations. So it's the varieties of expression are multiple in this, and like a lot of things, it depends on where you're standing as to how things look. So we can't be monolithic in the way that we look at this, but we can look at some of these commonalities. And so this is what Rabbit is doing. And he argues, and I think pretty convincingly, that there was sufficient transmitted memory of the African traditions to the North American context, in which that provided for continuities and with the older traditional religion. So he thinks that even all of this said, he doesn't want to overstate this, and I don't want to overstate this. He thinks that there's more discontinuity in North America than in Latin America. A lot of it has to do with demographic patterns, where people are, how concentrated the system of slavery is in Latin America versus North America. So again, a very different story if you're looking at Latin America versus North America. But there's still, and I think there's a pretty broad consensus that this continuity did exist. The traditional faiths were brought along, that they were then adapted to a Christian context, but not nearly as whole cloth as you see in Latin America. So, in any case, there's still an ongoing debate as to how much influence, how much of the old religious influence persists. It's pretty easy to show that for the 18th century, particularly when you have a tremendous number of enslaved persons coming directly from Africa. Just keeps that pipeline open, and as you move later in you're seeing these continuities more in the form of folk religion, and echoes and borrowings and adaptations that are being made at the everyday level, at the popular level. So folk religion continues to see a reasonable amount of African influence. There are traditions such as the hush harbor, which is a private, quiet form of religious practice that takes place in areas outside of the plantation quarters, where enslaved people are able to go by themselves and express themselves. Frequently marked by singing, drumming, loud, or well, no, not loud, but dancing, something like the ring shout, in which there's a very formulaic performance of dance that's led by the pastor. And you're seeing these things. You're seeing these expressions and these old ways of doing being adapted to a Christian theology. Things like grave decoration, very popular, and you're leaving pots and household goods on a gravestone or a gravesite, and that's a very West African tradition. It's a tradition that you see in the coastal parts of South Carolina, so you're still seeing these echoes. And one of the clearest examples here of the persistence is the testimony of white missionaries themselves, and they observed what they would have called heathen, or what they did call heathenish behavior or Islamic behavior. They're still in the WPA slave narratives. You are seeing people remembering parents or grandparents doing daily prayers and then practicing forms of magic, practicing traditional African rites. So there's plenty of evidence that there is a reasonable amount of continuity, and that this cultural memory is very, very important. So this is all to say that these private expressions of faith in these forms of continuity, particularly I think in the form of private religion, continue to express these continuities. When you're looking at a large church like Springfield, you're looking at a much wider pattern, much more European, North American pattern of performance and belief, and these places function differently than the private expression. So the last book I want to talk about today is Betty Wood and Sylvia Fry's Come Shouting to Zion. The subtitle is African American Protestantism in the American South and the British Caribbean to 1830. This is one of my favorite books of all time. It really is a fantastic summation of the scholarship up to about 1998. It's still a very influential book. It's a starting point for most scholars now who are working in African American religion, and it's a fantastically detailed book. And I think that if there's one of these that I've mentioned over the course of this hour that you want to pick up and read, it's Come Shouting to Zion. And what I like specifically about what Fry will do is that they look at dynamics and reciprocity, and they look at cultural interaction. It's a much more fluid model that they're using than any of the other scholars prior. They're using a lot of insights from critical theory in the 1980s and 90s, post-structuralism, and the cultural turn, the social turn in history. A lot of changes had taken place between Genovese and Rabbitoh, and then when prior writing. So new techniques to investigate documents, and of course, to a generation and a half of new scholarship, of monographic scholarship, of articles, of narrowly focused books. And so when you get to 1998, it's time for a synthesis, and Fry would do this brilliantly, I think. So again, it's hard to underestimate or understate how important this idea of making African American religion a reciprocal process, whereby African Americans express agency. That agency then influences white church leaders. There's a great book, Charles Irons' Study of Virginia, Religion in Nat Turner's Virginia, really takes this concept, this reciprocal process to a real fine-grained study of the development of religion in 1820s, 30s, and 40s Virginia. Just a great extrapolation that's coming out of Wood and Fry's modeling from the 1990s. So, and again, in Wood and Fry make a lot of this the notion that white religion and black religion are changing at the same time. That the revival culture that brings African Americans into the church in the 1740s and 50s is the same revival that is changing the way that whites practice faith. It's moving away from the Anglican church, moving towards more radical forms of Protestantism. The Baptists and the Methodists especially are very much the popular denomination. Again, that's why I want to do this whole thing on American religion in the next few months. Just think about the broader picture of this democratic change that's taking place. But so blacks and whites are both experiencing religion in new ways by the beginning of the 19th century, and that's happened in the last half of the 18th century, where this transition has taken place, where you're beginning to see everyday whites participating in meeting in churches, and then people of African descent creating their own congregations, creating Baptist congregations, forming Methodist congregations, and really beginning to carve out that place for themselves. So, the tension is interesting if you think of it from that perspective, that they both share a common heritage. Both the black expressions and the white expressions share a common heritage in revivals, and that there's a commonality, the sense of the including all believers, the equality of souls. It's radical in the 18th century. In 18th century Christianity, and it continues to be radical in its expression within black churches through at least the end of the 19th century and beyond. So, in any case, these parallel back and forth conversational, interactive, reciprocal relationships are really, really important. I think that Fry, if there's one thing that Fry Wood did that really just sent the whole field forward, by 1,000 miles, was this observation of this reciprocity. Michelle Sobel writes a book. She kind of follows up on Genovese's study. She called The World They Made Together, because the subtitle of Roll Jordan, Roll Slaves Nice. You're looking at relationships, and this is very, very important. And it was a very new way of looking at things just 20 years ago. Another thing that is important is that she observes, and again, she's following Du Bois, she's following somewhat Genovese, or they are, in focusing on the important role of women, and especially in the early church or in the days of slavery, but the continuing influence of women in the black church in the ways that they help create effective or emotional worship, the ways that they adopted revival culture, and very importantly, the ways that they create continuity between the generations. Generational connectivity is very much a role played by women in the nurturing of children in the households of the enslaved. So there's things that Fry Wood bring to the fore about the changes that are going on in the mid 18th century that made it possible or more probable that people of African descent would increasingly become associated with one of the Protestant churches. The first thing that they observe is that the language barriers by the mid to late 18th century are beginning to fall. That there's more English being spoken amongst the enslaved populations, which then makes it possible for missionaries like John Wesley or George Whitefield to appeal directly to enslaved people. Again, repeating myself, there's a shift from that Anglican formalism to a more emotional and popular revivalism, and that emotional expressiveness is something that really resonates, it seems, with many African American or within many African American contexts. The kinds of performance and ritual that come out of West Africa aren't the kinds of rituals that you would have seen in an Anglican church in the mid-19th century. It would be much more emotional experience, a much more performative experience, and revivalism had enough within that of that form of religious expression to be appealing. Again, we get back to this theological emphasis on revivalism that focuses on spiritual equality, at least in the conversion moment, the moment of conversion is the whole goal of revival and revival preaching. That there's a breaking down of that. Some historians will go so far as to argue there's a breaking down of racial barriers in that context, where there's really a true biracial communalism that comes out of that. Probably goes a little farther than I'm comfortable with interpreting things, because I think the race line is pretty clearly maintained. In any case, another thing that's very important here is that oral performance and public speaking were a very important part of the revivalist toolbox, and most of the enslaved people who are in the Americas come from primary oral cultures. So this is a familiar way of communicating, a familiar way of gaining insight and understanding. So there's some important folks who help move the cause of Protestantism forward. John Wesley, and Wesley comes to Georgia in the 1740s. Slavery is still illegal in Georgia, but he goes across the state line into South Carolina, and he finds some plantation owners who are interested in providing religious instruction to the enslaved people they owned. And Wesley then begins a pretty extensive missionary effort on behalf of the Church of England, and then, of course, as later as Methodist, that begins to open opportunities for enslaved populations to come into these churches. George Whitefield travels to the South to Savannah and Charleston in the 40s and 1740s, and he also makes very direct appeals to African Americans, and his particularly his focus on millennialism, or the coming perfect world, and spiritual regeneration, and the release of souls becomes very important aspects of both the revival culture and the revival culture as it's understood by African Americans in South Carolina and Georgia. Just to really kind of sum things up, I want us to think about the institutions that are built and what's going on in those institutions, and it's actually a fairly simple thing. If you've ever looked at Rodney Stark's The Rise of Christianity, he makes a lot of family connections and institutions that serve specific needs of specific communities have a natural pattern of growth. And I think that it's a very similar kind of pattern of growth is going on in these African American churches in the first part of the late 18th and early part of the 19th century. And what Fine would do in great detail is that they break out how the church, how conversions took place. and what kinds of patterns you could see. But in the pattern they saw was family conversions. Families were coming in together. They were joining the churches at the same time. So it's an extension of family connections that you're seeing in the early churches. These communities, these church communities together very, very clearly. And what Friar would do, they use the church records, the church minute books themselves to just count and see when people came into church and who was related to who. Really important insight. They also recognized from the church rosters that Black women were, and this is how John Wood put it, formed the fragile backbone of the congregation. Enslaved women made a simple majority of those admitted to full communion. The same thing is happening in white evangelical churches. Women are the backbone of these institutions. And in the case of the African American churches, Friar Wood observed that the moral and religious responsibility for the slave household were women, and those women formed the building blocks of the Black evangelical church. So significant impact by Black women in these churches and these congregations. And in a lot of ways, you can see, certainly after the American Revolution, you can see in these churches expressions of a revolutionary memory, of a way that the performance of being Baptist, for example, and Methodist very early on in the late 18th, early 19th century had a lot of trouble recruiting African American members. That changes by the 20s or so. But the thing that was most popular about the Baptists amongst African Americans is that they had complete autonomy over the church. They had complete control over choosing the pastors, choosing the church deacons, setting up their rites and rituals. It was an experiment in democracy, and I've argued that memory created a real true sense of American national inclusion. That when asked, for example, when Jacob Walker, the Springfield Church, was asked in 1829 by a group of white political leaders in Augusta, Georgia. This is in the heyday of colonization. When he was asked if his congregation wanted to go back to Africa, the words that they used, and he said no. He said, and these are his words, he said, most of us were born in this country, and of course we claim to be Americans. And it was in the churches, especially the Baptist churches, that many African Americans carved out that space for themselves, and that carved out that memory and created that memory of the American Revolution, and embraced that notion, those universal notions of freedom, just as they had embraced the universality of all souls. Brought those together to form a very important way of thinking about themselves and thinking about themselves in the United States. So that's where I'm going to end today. I think we've got plenty more to do in the coming weeks. Rob, do we have any questions, or did I just keep rolling along?
Yes, we have a really good one. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you okay.
All right, great. One question came in, and Sean says, did I read in one of Du Bois's writings that criticized early American male church pastors, like the Philadelphia Black founding church leaders, of a lack of stewardship for not progressively moving the church toward an anti-slavery agenda?
Yeah, he did, and that is the essay. I think that you're referencing the essay, and I'm suddenly forgetting the title. Let me go back to my notes. Will the church remove the color line? And that's not the only place that Du Bois is openly critical of both the Black and the white church. He is in the by the 1910s very critical of many Black churches for hoarding resources, for not providing the kind of social network support that's needed. So yeah, he understands the the importance of the institutions, but he also saw in the real value of those institutions to communities and individuals. But he also saw the shortcomings. He certainly saw the shortcomings. We can go back to Frederick Douglass and earlier, looking at Black writers arguing very strongly that religion was the tool that was being used to enforce slavery, and that something needed to be done about that. Unfortunately, the ministers the Black ministers who make the strongest arguments, theological arguments against slavery, were in mid-19th century America largely ignored. Martin Noll writes about them very eloquently in his book, Civil Wars: Crisis of Theology. There's a theological crisis, and there are compelling arguments that are being made by Black ministers that are anti-slavery, but they're being ignored. So yeah, there are certain limits, and Du Bois was not afraid to identify both the benefits, the uplift capacity of the church, and also the failings of the church.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And that's the only question that we have for today.
That was a good question. I like that one. All right. Well, I think that's what we've got for the day, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks to talk about some of the broader trends in American religion and in the first part of the 19th century. So y'all take care, and I will see you soon. Thanks.